David Fletcher, 42, had always been a family man. His home on Pine Ridge Road was the gathering place for every family event, especially for his twin nieces, Sarah and Khloe Reid. From the time they were children, the Reid twins spent their summers at David's house. It was large, with a sprawling backyard and a swimming pool that was the center of all their fun. The parties were innocent, filled with barbecues, laughter, and late-night games of hide and seek. David enjoyed their company, and his wife, Karen, thought nothing of it. After all, he was the cool uncle. As Sarah and Khloe turned 18, things began to change. Now high school graduates, they still spent their weekends at David's, lounging by the pool and bringing their teenage energy into his otherwise quiet life. Their visits, however, started to feel different. Karen was often away on business, leaving David alone with the girls. He tried to tell himself that it was nothing unusual, just family. But when the twins began sunbathing topless, giggling without a care, something shifted inside him. At first, he averted his eyes, embarrassed. But soon he found himself watching, staring longer than he should. Sarah and Khloe seemed unfazed, almost as if they knew what they were doing. He became trapped between the lingering innocence of their visits and the growing tension building within him. It was the summer heat, he convinced himself, the haze of the days blending together in a way that made everything feel surreal. Still, Sarah and Khloe were no longer the children he remembered. They were young women now, and they carried with them a certain confidence, a confidence that David found himself unable to resist. And as time went on, the Reid twins would use that knowledge to manipulate him into a dangerous game. The twins had always been close, sharing secrets, clothes, and even boyfriends. By the time they were 18, they were no strangers to exploring their own desires. Their bond was deeper than anyone realized, and they found thrill in pushing boundaries together. In high school, they'd taken things further than most sisters would, sharing a boyfriend in secret, turning their intimacy into something exhilarating. It was all a game to them, a game of control. They could see the effect they had on David, and it wasn't long before Sarah whispered her plan to Khloe during one of their many lazy afternoons by the pool. "He's watching us," Sarah said, lowering her sunglasses and glancing at David through the patio door. "Do you see how he looks at us now?" Khloe nodded, grinning mischievously. It's like he's too scared to admit it. David's discomfort was evident. He lingered at the kitchen window, pretending to clean or read, but his eyes always drifted back to the girls. He couldn't help himself. The guilt gnawed at him, yet the attraction was undeniable. He tried to push the feelings aside, but the twins knew exactly what they were doing. They enjoyed the power they held over him, testing how far they could push before he broke. That day, Sarah and Khloe decided to escalate their game. They slipped into his bedroom while Karen was away and found him sitting on the edge of the bed, nervously scrolling through his phone. "Uncle David," Sarah cooed, her voice soft and teasing. "Why do you keep avoiding us? We're just having fun." David flustered, tried to stand, but Khloe moved closer, pressing a finger to his chest. "It's okay. We're adults now. We know what we're doing." What followed was the first crossing of a line David never imagined he would. The twins used their charm and twisted seduction to lure him into a dangerous affair, one that would consume them all. As weeks turned into months, David's life became a whirlwind of secrets and guilt. His affair with Sarah and Khloe became more than just a dark fantasy. It was an addiction. They visited him whenever Karen wasn't home, and sometimes even when she was. The thrill of being with both sisters at once was intoxicating, overwhelming every rational thought he had left. He couldn't say no, even when he tried. The twins, meanwhile, reveled in their control over him. They knew he was in too deep, that he was completely under their spell. But it wasn't long before they grew bored of the game. The excitement that once fueled their secret meetings began to fade. David's obsession, his constant neediness, became tiresome to them. It was no longer fun. It was suffocating. Maybe we should stop going over there, Khloe suggested one evening as they lay in bed together. He's getting too attached. It's not fun anymore. Sarah nodded in agreement, her gaze distant. Yeah, he's starting to creep me out. It's like he's always watching us, waiting. Without warning, they stopped visiting. Their texts became fewer, their calls ignored. The twins found new distractions, boys their own age who weren't weighed down by guilt or desperation. But for David, their sudden absence was unbearable. He needed them like air. Every time they didn't show up, his jealousy grew. Every unanswered message felt like a dagger in his chest. The thought of Sarah and Khloe with other men made him sick. He couldn't stand the idea of them being touched by anyone else. His obsession turned into something far more dangerous. David's mind twisted with thoughts of revenge. If he couldn't have them, no one could. David's jealousy morphed into a deep, violent rage. He began to plot, envisioning the moment he would make them pay for abandoning him. Night after night, he lay awake, consumed by thoughts of Sarah and Khloe laughing with other men, forgetting all about him. His love for them had turned into a seething hatred, and in his mind, there was only one solution left. He meticulously planned every detail of their demise. He knew he had to be careful. He had to make it look like an accident. He spent hours researching ways to cover his tracks, studying crime documentaries and police procedures online. No one would suspect him, he thought. After all, he was their beloved uncle, the man who had taken care of them since they were kids. No one would believe he was capable of murder. David knew he would need to lure them back to the house. He texted the girls, pretending everything was normal, inviting them over for one last summer party before they went off to college. It was the perfect excuse. One last goodbye, he told them. Reluctantly, Sarah and Khloe agreed, planning to show up for just a couple of hours. They didn't suspect a thing. They still saw David as harmless, their naive uncle who would never cross the line again. What they didn't know was that their lives were already over. On the day of the party, Karen arrived home early, her gut instinct telling her something was wrong. She hadn't suspected much at first. David had always been good with the girls, but lately, his strange behavior, the late nights, and his erratic mood swings had raised suspicions she could no longer ignore. She couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was happening behind her back. When she entered the house, the first thing she saw was blood. It was everywhere, splattered on the walls, pooling on the floor. And then she saw them, Sarah and Khloe, lifeless, their bodies mutilated beyond recognition. David stood over them, his hands shaking, the knife still clutched in his grasp. His eyes met hers, but he said nothing. In that moment, Karen knew everything. The affair, the betrayal, the murder. It all came crashing down on her. The man she had loved for years had become a monster. Without thinking, she grabbed the nearest object, a heavy iron from the fireplace, and swung it with all her strength. The sound of metal hitting bone was sickening, but she didn't stop. Blow after blow, she unleashed her fury on him until he collapsed beside the nieces he had killed. David was dead, and so was any semblance of the life they once shared. When the police arrived, they found Karen sitting silently on the floor, covered in blood, her expression blank. She didn't resist when they cuffed her, didn't speak a word during her trial. The story of David Fletcher and his twin nieces became a dark legend in their small town. When the police arrived at the Fletcher home, they found Karen sitting silently in the middle of the carnage. Her hands, face, and clothes were soaked in blood. David's lifeless body lay next to the twin nieces, Sarah and Khloe Reid, who had been brutally murdered hours earlier. Karen's eyes were hollow, her expression devoid of any emotion, as the officers placed handcuffs around her wrists. The small town of Fairview was shattered by the news. No one could fathom that David, the friendly, dependable uncle, could have been capable of such a monstrous act. The whispers about Karen, too, were relentless. How could she not have known what was happening under her roof? The gossip grew louder and the media swarmed the case, dubbing it the Fletcher family massacre. In court, Karen remained silent, her head bowed as the prosecution laid out the gruesome details. The police had uncovered evidence of David's secret affair with the twins, messages, photos, and even a hidden camera in the guest bedroom. David's obsession had been well documented, leaving no doubt that his jealousy over their departure drove him to kill. But Karen's part in the story was not so clear. The prosecution painted her as a betrayed wife who snapped, but her defense lawyer argued that she had simply stumbled upon a nightmare in progress and did what any mother would do. The courtroom was divided. Some saw Karen as a hero, delivering justice to the man who had destroyed her family, while others saw her as a cold-blooded killer who had taken the law into her own hands. Either way, the tragedy was inescapable. Chapter 7. The Trial of Karen Fletcher. The trial captivated the nation, transforming Karen Fletcher into a figure of both sympathy and controversy. The details of the murders were laid bare in court. David's obsession with his nieces, the months-long affair, and the horrific final moments when he lured them back to his home under the guise of a farewell party. Forensic evidence painted a horrifying picture of the night. Sarah and Khloe had been drugged before being stabbed to death, their bodies showing signs of a violent struggle. The defense tried to shift focus to David's manipulation and depravity. They argued that Karen had discovered the murders in progress, catching David standing over the bodies of her nieces. Overcome with grief and rage, she acted in self-defense when he turned on her, snapping under the weight of the trauma. But the prosecution had a different story to tell. They claimed that Karen had known about the affair all along and, in a fit of jealous rage, had planned her own revenge. Their theory was that she had arrived early on purpose, perhaps even encouraging David to invite the twins that night, knowing what would unfold. According to the prosecution, Karen's brutal attack on David was no act of self-defense. It was premeditated murder. Day after day, the courtroom was filled with tense testimonies and shocking revelations. Karen's composure remained unshaken, never uttering a word in her own defense. Her silence left a void, one that the media and public were eager to fill with speculation. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity. The weight of the case hung over the courtroom, a dark cloud that would forever stain the town of Fairview. Would Karen be seen as a victim, avenging the horrifying deaths of her nieces? Or would she be condemned as a cold-blooded killer, guilty of murdering her husband in an act of calculated revenge? When the jury finally returned, the tension in the courtroom was unbearable. Karen sat motionless, her eyes fixed on the floor as the foreman read the verdict. Not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. There was an audible gasp from the gallery. Some cried out in anger, others in relief. The court ruled that Karen had suffered a mental breakdown upon discovering the horrific scene and had acted in a moment of extreme emotional distress. She would not serve time in prison, but would be required to undergo treatment in a psychiatric facility for an indefinite period. Karen was led away in silence, never once showing any sign of reaction. She had become a ghost of the woman she once was, a figure consumed by the horror that had unfolded in her home. In the months that followed the trial, Fairview was never the same. The house on Pine Ridge stood abandoned, a grim reminder of the events that had transpired there. No one dared to go near it, not even the real estate agents brave enough to list it for sale. It became a symbol of tragedy, a place where innocence was lost and lives were ruined beyond repair. The media frenzy died down, but the story lived on in whispers. The town's residents couldn't help but wonder what really happened in that house. Did Karen know about the affair all along? Was David truly a monster, or was there more to the story? The mystery, the unanswered questions, lingered like a dark stain on the town's memory. Sarah and Khloe Reid were laid to rest in a quiet ceremony, attended by a handful of grieving family members. Their parents never recovered from the loss, moving far away from Fairview in hopes of escaping the nightmare that had engulfed their lives. Years passed, and Karen remained locked away in a psychiatric institution, her fate largely forgotten by the outside world. But within those walls, she replayed the events of that fateful night over and over in her mind. What had she missed? How had it come to this? The life she had once known was gone, her husband dead, her nieces murdered, her home nothing more than a haunted memory. She rarely spoke to anyone, lost in a world of her own making. The doctors tried to reach her, but Karen kept her secrets close, refusing to share the darkest corners of her thoughts. She knew what she had done, she knew the weight of it, and she carried it with her like a shroud. No one from Fairview visited. Her family had abandoned her, her friends distanced themselves, and the town that had once known her as a loving wife and aunt had turned its back on her. She was alone forever, tied to the dark legacy of the Fletcher murders, and in the quiet of her room, Karen sometimes wondered if she truly was insane, or if, in that moment of savage revenge, she had finally seen the world for what it really was, a place where love could turn to hatred and trust could unravel into unspeakable violence. The end she knew would come for her one day, but until then, she would remain trapped in the nightmare of her own making, haunted by the ghosts of those she had lost and those she had killed. Inside the walls of the psychiatric facility, time lost all meaning for Karen Fletcher. The sterile white rooms and cold metal beds offered no comfort. The same routine day in and day out, medication, therapy, silence. Karen had become a shadow of herself, floating through each day with no sense of purpose or end. She had made peace with her isolation. The world outside had moved on without her, and deep down, she was relieved. She didn't have to face the whispers, the accusations, or the weight of what she had done, but the silence of the institution was deceptive. Inside her mind, Karen was far from alone. The memory of that night, the blood, the screams, the raw violence, played out like a broken record, and mixed in with that horror were the darker, more forbidden thoughts that had haunted her long before the murders. She had known something was wrong with David, but had she ignored it? Had she allowed her husband to spiral into obsession while she turned a blind eye? Karen's days were consumed with thoughts of David and the twins, those tangled, taboo emotions that still burned in her despite everything. She could still see them, Sarah and Khloe, their laughter echoing through the house as they toyed with David's affection, pushing him to the edge. And now, in the quiet of her room, she wondered, had it excited her too? At night, Karen's mind wandered into dangerous territory. The sterile walls of the facility melted away, and she was back in her own home, reliving the memories she had tried so hard to bury. She saw David, shirtless in the summer heat, watching the twins as they sunbathed by the pool, their bronze skin glistening in the afternoon sun. She had caught him once, staring, his breath shallow and his eyes filled with something darker than admiration. But it wasn't just David's obsession that haunted her. It was her own complicated feelings, her own repressed desires. She remembered the way Sarah and Khloe looked at her, the glances that lingered a little too long. She had dismissed it then, chalked it up to teenage curiosity, but now those moments felt charged, electric, as if she had missed something vital. Had she been jealous of David, of the girls? She wasn't sure anymore. Her mind twisted the memories into something she could no longer untangle. She pictured the twins in the pool, their laughter filling the air as they whispered to each other, their bodies close, always close. She had seen them sneak into David's room that night, their lithe figures slipping through the door like shadows. She had known, even then, what was happening, and deep down, a part of her had wanted to watch. Karen's pulse quickened as the memories grew more vivid, more sensual. She remembered the night she walked in on them, David, Sarah, and Khloe tangled together in a mess of sheets and forbidden pleasure. She had frozen in the doorway, her heart racing, her breath catching in her throat. They hadn't noticed her, too wrapped up in each other, too consumed by their own desires. For a moment, she had felt a surge of something. Was it rage? Lust? She couldn't tell, but instead of confronting them, she had quietly backed away, retreating into the shadows of her own mind. That night had been the beginning of the end. She knew it now. It wasn't just the affair that had destroyed them. It was the way it had made her feel, the way it had awakened something dark and primal inside her. The doctors in the facility would never understand. How could they? They talked of trauma and healing, but they didn't know the truth. They didn't know that sometimes the darkest parts of yourself are the ones that feel the most alive. As Karen lay in bed, her fingers brushing the thin, itchy blanket, she felt the pulse of desire that had been lying dormant for so long. The sterile environment of the psychiatric facility couldn't erase the memories that now filled her mind. Memories of the twins, Sarah and Khloe, in those tight bikinis, laughing carelessly by the pool. They'd stroll through her house with an air of youthful arrogance, knowing exactly how their presence affected David and unknowingly how they stirred something in Karen herself. She remembered the way their eyes would linger on her, the stolen glances in the hallway, the brief touches when they'd pass by her in the kitchen. There was a tension there, something she had never fully acknowledged, but now in the isolation of the facility, she could admit it to herself. She hadn't just been the jealous wife, she had been envious of their freedom, their ability to manipulate David, to control him without a second thought. Karen's pulse quickened as she imagined what could have been. What if she had acted on the pull she felt? What if she had crossed the line first, indulging in the dangerous taboo desires that were always just below the surface? The thought filled her with a strange sense of regret, mingled with excitement. She closed her eyes, letting the forbidden fantasy take hold. The girls' soft laughter echoed in her mind, their bodies tangled together in her sheets. It was wrong, she knew that, but the wrongness was part of the allure. For the first time in her life, she had stopped fighting it. The line between lust and anger, jealousy and desire blurred into one chaotic storm, and she was helpless to resist. The night Karen walked in on David with the twins had been more than just a moment of betrayal. It had been the moment she realized how deeply her own desires had been buried. At first, all she had seen was the act itself, their tangled bodies on the bed, the raw heat of their movements. But as the memory played out over and over in her mind, it became something more. She remembered standing in the doorway, watching as Khloe's lips parted in a soft moan, Sarah's hand trailing down David's chest with a slow, deliberate touch. There was something magnetic about the way they moved together, like they knew the power they held, not just over David, but over anyone watching. Karen had been frozen there, not out of shock, but out of something darker, something that had stirred inside her the moment she saw them. She had wanted to be part of it, not just as an observer, but as a participant in the twisted, forbidden dance that was unfolding before her. Her breath had quickened, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched Khloe's eyes flutter open, meeting hers across the room. There had been no fear in Khloe's gaze, only an invitation, a challenge. In her fantasies, Karen replayed that moment 100 different ways. She imagined herself stepping forward, closing the door behind her, and taking control of the situation. She pictured the way David would look at her, confused but too far gone to stop what was happening. The twins would welcome her into their bed, their hands reaching for her, pulling her into their world of pleasure and control. The power she had craved for so long would finally be hers. The days after the night of betrayal became a blur for Karen, but the fantasy of what could have been lingered. Each time she closed her eyes, she could see them, Sarah and Khloe, their bodies entwined, their hands sliding over David's skin. But this time she was there too. It was no longer a memory of pain or anger, but one of control. She would be the one leading them, guiding their hands, their mouths, their movements. In this fantasy, Karen was no longer the victim. She was the seducer. She imagined herself walking into the room with confidence, her presence shifting the dynamic entirely. David would watch in stunned silence as she joined them, his role in the affair diminished as Karen claimed what had once been his. Her fingers would trace the curves of the twins' bodies, feeling the heat of their skin under her touch. And for the first time in years, she would be the one in control. The thought filled her with a strange, electrifying thrill. In the past, she had always been the dutiful wife, the one who held everything together while David unraveled. But now, in the silence of her room, she embraced the darker side of herself, the side that had been awakened by what she had witnessed. The fantasy grew with each passing night, becoming more vivid, more real. Karen imagined the way Sarah's breath would hitch as she leaned in close, her lips brushing against her neck, the way Khloe's hands would slide down her back, pulling her deeper into their twisted embrace. The power would be intoxicating, the thrill of crossing that forbidden line like nothing she had ever experienced before. She would never be the same again. As Karen lay in her cold, sterile room, the faint hum of the overhead lights and distant murmur of the facility staff became white noise. The revelations about her own desires had shifted something deep within her, something that had been buried beneath years of routine, lies, and quiet betrayal. She hadn't been the passive observer she once convinced herself she was. No, Karen had wanted it all: the power, the control, the dangerous allure of forbidden pleasures that came from knowing and not acting. The nights inside the psychiatric facility became more vivid as her mind. She remembered every detail: how Sarah and Khloe would walk through the hallways in those tight, skimpy swimsuits, their skin glistening from the heat. They were teasing, laughing, fully aware of the way their bodies moved, aware of David's eyes trailing after them like a moth to a flame. Karen, pretending to busy herself with chores or errands, would watch from the periphery, but even then she had felt a tension. It wasn't just jealousy, it was something darker, something far more complex. Karen remembered the glances, how Khloe would catch her watching from the kitchen window, holding eye contact a beat too long before flashing that knowing smile. Sarah had been more subtle, more dangerous in her own way, leading David along while keeping an air of mystery, a barely suppressed wildness that electrified the air whenever she was near. And Karen had been in the middle of it all, pretending to be oblivious, telling herself she was simply the wrong wife. But now, as her mind dove deeper into those memories, she wondered if she had been lying to herself all along. Had she wanted to be part of their twisted games, to feel what they felt, to indulge in the primal pleasure that came from crossing those lines? The night Karen walked in on David with Sarah and Khloe had been a turning point, but not for the reasons she had originally thought. It wasn't just the betrayal that had left her breathless. It was the sight of them together, their limbs tangled in sheets, their breath coming in soft, quickened gasps as they explored each other with a reckless abandon that Karen had long forgotten. She had frozen in the doorway, her body tingling with a strange mix of horror and fascination. The girls hadn't even flinched when she entered the room, as if they had expected her, as if this was part of the game. Khloe had turned her head, locking eyes with Karen, her lips parting in a slow, sensual smile as David's hands roamed her bare skin. Sarah, lying beside her sister, gave a soft, breathless laugh, as if she too knew the power she wielded over Karen. For a moment, Karen hadn't known what to do. The rational part of her screamed to turn away, to confront David, to throw him out, but the darker part of her, the part she was only just now acknowledging, wanted to watch. Her breath quickened as she stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to tear her eyes away from the scene unfolding before her. There had been something intoxicating about their reckless, youthful energy, the way they moved together, the raw, physical pleasure that seemed to pulse through the room. And for the first time in her marriage, Karen felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in years: desire. It wasn't just for David or for the twins, but for the power they had, the way they controlled the dynamic. Karen wanted to feel that power, to take it for herself, but instead she had turned away, retreating into the shadows, letting her rage fester until it exploded in the violent way that left her trapped in this place. Now, as she lay in bed, Karen's thoughts drifted back to that night with a new clarity. The memory played out differently in her mind now, not as a moment of betrayal, but as a lost opportunity, an opportunity to break free from the confines of her role as the dutiful wife, to step into the dark, seductive world the twins had invited her into. What would have happened if she hadn't turned away? If she had walked into that room, closed the door, and joined them? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Karen imagined herself there, in the dim light of the bedroom, feeling the heat of their bodies against hers, the forbidden thrill of crossing that line. She would have taken control, she thought, pushed David aside and claimed the moment for herself. It was this power, this hunger for control, that had been growing inside her for years, festering in the back of her mind. And now, in the sterile silence of the psychiatric ward, she couldn't help but wonder if that desire had always been there, lurking beneath the surface of her carefully constructed life. Karen closed her eyes, letting the memory play out in full. She pictured herself walking toward the bed, her hands trailing over Sarah's bare shoulder, Khloe's breath quickening as she leaned in. David would have watched, confused at first, then mesmerized as his wife took control of the scene, becoming the one in charge. She would have felt their skin under her fingers, their soft gas as she touched them, and the power that surged through her in that moment would have been undeniable. But that was all fantasy now. She had made her choice that night, and it had led her here, trapped in a place where her desires were nothing more than fleeting memories. And yet, as she lay in the dark, Karen couldn't help but smile at the thought. Perhaps the world had seen her as the victim, but deep down, she knew the truth. The real Karen had been waiting for this awakening all along, and now there was no going back. Days in the psychiatric facility blurred into one another. The routine was monotonous, but Karen's mind was more alive than it had ever been. Every night she would let the memory play out, each time with a new twist. In her fantasies, she wasn't the passive observer anymore. She was the one guiding the events, steering the chaotic energy between David and the twins toward something darker, something far more exhilarating. The therapist still tried to reach her, talking about trauma and guilt, about recovery. But Karen had long since stopped listening. What they didn't understand was that she wasn't searching for absolution. She was embracing the darkness that had always been a part of her. The reflection in the mirror no longer looked like the Karen Fletcher of before. Her once tidy appearance had been replaced by a disheveled, almost feral version of herself. But Karen didn't mind. This was who she was now, unshackled, free from the constraints of her old life, and finally awake to the true nature of her desires. Each night the fantasies grew more vivid, more twisted. She would imagine different scenarios. Sometimes she would walk in on David and the twins and join them. Other times she would take control of the entire scene from the beginning, orchestrating every movement, every touch. In these dreams, she was no longer the scorned wife. She was the seducer, the one with all the power. It wasn't just about sex. It was about control, about taking what she had been denied for so long. In her mind, Karen replayed every touch, every glance, every forbidden moment that had passed between her and the twins, imagining how different things could have been if she had simply acted on her desires. Karen knew the outside world would never understand the transformation she had undergone. The doctor spoke of reintegration, of recovery and healing, but none of it mattered to her anymore. She had come to terms with her desires, with the darkness that had always been a part of her. Lurking just beneath the surface, the world outside the psychiatric facility held no appeal for her. It was in this quiet, sane environment that she had found a strange sort of freedom, a freedom to explore the twisted fantasies that had taken hold of her mind. In her final nights there, Karen let her thoughts wander back to the house on Pine Ridge, to the sultry summer nights that had once seemed so innocent. Now they were anything but. The house wasn't just a home anymore. It was a playground for the darkest parts of her psyche, a place where the lines between right and wrong, pleasure and pain, blurred into oblivion. She pictured herself walking into that house one last time, her movements slow and deliberate. The twins would be waiting for her, their bodies draped in silk sheets, their eyes dark with desire. David would be nowhere to be seen. He was irrelevant now. This was her world, her fantasy, and she was the one in control. Karen smiled to herself as the scene played out in her mind. She could feel the heat of their skin, the soft gasps as she touched them, the way they would respond to her every move. This was her final embrace, not of redemption or forgiveness, but of the darkness that had always been there. Lurking just out of reach, the doctors could call it madness, but Karen knew better. This was her truth, her power. And as she lay in the sterile bed of the facility, she finally understood. She had never been the victim. She was the one who had always held the key to her own liberation. Now there was no going back.